Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
So today's topic, hauntings in the South. So where did you want to start? I mean, I've got a couple of stories for sure, personal experiences. But if we want to start somewhere else, yeah, you were going to go to Savannah or some like that. So we best go to Savannah because the picture that I posted in the link to the show from today is from Savannah.
Oh, okay.
So we'll start in Savannah.
Okay.
All right.
So the first location is called the Sorrel Weed House.
Ah, okay. There we go. He's wearing the T-shirt and everything.
We've got a T-shirt from the museum that's there now, and
I have not been there.
I haven't either. It was my cousin actually who was there, and she was tweeting and saying, oh yeah, I'm gonna go off on all these ghost tours all around Savannah. And I said, well, you got to bring me back a T-shirt or something. So she did, and I got this Sorrel Weed House.
Savannah was this haunted T-shirt.
Yeah, haunted T-shirt. Yeah. Okay, so the Sorrel Weed House, it's a historic property that is preserved within that downtown historic district within Savannah. And it's located in what they call Madison Park, or Madison Square, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Madison Square, which is, I've seen pictures, and it really is a very beautiful, picturesque park area.
Mm-hmm.
And this park was the site of the siege of Savannah in 1779 during the Revolutionary War, and that battle claimed over 1,000 lives in just a couple of hours. So because of all of this, it's known to be a source of paranormal activity within that area.
Okay.
And it was British property at the time. And they had a soldiers' barracks built on the site where the house now sits. And the house was built in 1838 by Francis Sorrel. I'm not sure where the weed comes in with that, because it's Francis Sorrel. He was a wealthy shipping merchant, and he had built this house for his wife. And when the house was being built, they uncovered the remains of British soldiers from that battle.
Okay, so what battle is this?
The siege of Savannah.
Oh, so was this around the time of the War of 1812, or
the American Revolutionary War, 1779.
Okay. Right. Okay, so the Rev War. All right.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So there they are now. Years have gone by. We're in 1838. They're building this house, and they uncover these remains of these British soldiers, uniforms, buttons, weapons, and they still believe today that there's still more buried underneath the house.
Right.
So, excuse me. So, like a lot of the the other wealthy Southern families, the Sorrells had slaves. And it's told that Mr. Sorrell was caught having sex with one of the young female slaves, and he was caught by his wife.
What a surprise.
Who apparently actually walked in on them while they were having sex. And she was just apparently so distraught from this event that she went and committed suicide. And afterwards, this young slave girl was found hanging by a noose up in the rafters of the slave quarters. So it was never determined, did she commit suicide? Was she murdered by Mr. Sorrell to cover up what would have been a huge scandal at the time? And so there's you've got all of this. You've got the soldiers, you've got the battle, you've got these events that took place in the house. And this affair between Mr. Sorrell and this young woman, this is actually documented. This isn't just rumors that have developed over the years. This actually comes from letters that have come down through the family over the years.
Well, it's hardly surprising. I mean, let's face it, in that antebellum period when, people were enslaved, it was a fairly typical, I hate to say it, common thing for, these men who would take advantage and rape these women frequently. I mean, I like how they say affair, to make it sound like it's consensual. Right, but probably 9 times out of 10, it was not consensual.
As they're taking advantage of them, yeah.
Oh, for sure, and it's pretty disgusting, but we know that it happens, and to cover it up is, to me, a bigger criminal offense than to let it out and let people know the kinds of things that happened. But yeah, it's interesting. So you were saying about the name of the house. So I did actually find out why it's called Weed. So what it was is it's the Sorrell Weed House. And like you said, built by Sorrell originally. But in 1859, there was a purchase agreement made between Savannah businessman Henry D. Weed, and he took possession of the house in 1862. And it remained lived until 1901. But this is, I guess, in 1859, this was when Henry Weed took possession of the home. So that is why it has that, the 2 names attached to it at this point.
Okay.
So that was my bit of research there.
All right. So to continue with as to why this house is considered to be one of actually the most haunted buildings in all of Savannah. So you've got the soldiers, you've got the events that took place in the house. Francis Sorrell's oldest son was a surgeon, and he turned the basement of the house into this great big surgery room. And I'm not exactly sure what time period this was. Was he doing civilian medical operations, or was he doing military surgeons or military surgeries during that Civil War period?
Except that Weed had purchased the house already by that point, right? Because Weed purchases the house in 1862.
So it must have been civilian operations that he was doing then.
Interestingly enough, because I mean, at this point in time, as we know, as far as the medical, procedures, and that you paid to get your doctor's title. I mean, there wasn't really any practice of surgery or anything at this point, and especially if it's prior to Civil War. I mean, there's some really horrific stories about, surgeries in the Civil War, and in particular,
Yeah.
there's a very interesting story that we should talk about at another time, about a gentleman who was a doctor, who, essentially went on to spend a great deal of time at Broadmoor and, the asylum in England, and was a contributor to the Oxford Dictionary. But that's a very interesting story and tied to the Civil War. So it's kind of questionable to me then exactly what was happening in terms of, being a surgeon, or obviously doctors existed to a degree, but a lot of times, even in that earlier period, even like 1812 and, up until like 1830, a lot of times if you needed surgery, your surgeon was a dentist, sometimes even the veterinarian. So if at least they were the veterinarian, I would go, okay, good, because at that time, for a veterinarian, you had to apprentice for 5 years. But to be a doctor, you just had to buy your way through school. So, sort of an interesting juxtaposition there, right? I think that, it's rather questionable who or what he would be doing in terms of surgeries, right?
Yeah,
So
I'm sure a lot of them didn't end too well.
Probably not, but I think that, that's one of those stories where it's really hard to validate. And yeah, it makes for a good story to attach to the house. And he could have been a doctor. He could have very easily been a doctor and perhaps performed even maybe just minor surgeries in the home, right? But probably set up a practice in the basement of the house. And that's sort of where the story of surgery, can kind of grows from there, right?
Yeah.
But interesting though. Obviously the energy in the house and the things, I always look at it this way. I don't think there's a plantation in the South, and I'm going to say it, that it can possibly escape the horrors of people who suffered greatly at the hands of plantation owners.
Oh, exactly.
I'm sure this is another location that is equally as, disturbing in those regards. And, it probably carries a lot of energy and residual energy.
I think there's a lot of residual energy there.
Probably, yeah, it would be pretty. I've been to some of the southern plantations, and I can tell you they're not. To me, they feel horribly oppressive and very. I get different feelings at different locations, but we'll talk about that when I talk about my thing. But I've been to Savannah, but I was a kid the last time I was in Savannah. I think I was maybe 14. So I don't really remember much about Savannah. I remember a lot of the old beautiful, sort of antebellum homes in the old part of Savannah. But ghost tours and that weren't a big thing in 1977. So,
that's a more recent thing.
Yeah, there was some historical things. And I remember us going on a historical walking tour, but they didn't touch on any ghosts or hauntings or anything like that at that time. And I haven't been back since. So, but it was a pretty place to visit. But I certainly, even at that age, remember feeling very overwhelmed by a lot of the energy in some areas that we were in. So
yeah.
But interesting that, and I know there's a lot of other places now, like Savannah has quite a number of ghost tours and haunted tours, and, obviously taking advantage of that tourism aspect of things, right?
Sure.
I run haunted tours myself. So, and there's likely quite a number of very true and real hauntings and or stories that go with it. So yeah, was there any other locations in Savannah that you?
Yeah, there's another location which is actually only a couple of blocks away from the Sorrel Weed House,
Mm-hmm.
and it's called the Moon River Brewing Company.
Oh, I have heard of this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and originally it was the very first hotel in Savannah in 1821, and it was called the City Hotel, which makes me laugh because, boy, a lot of thought went into that name, didn't it? The City Hotel.
I guess you couldn't go wrong, right? You know, it's like,
yeah.
Where do you stay when you go to Savannah? The City Hotel.
Yeah. So, anyways, today it's a microbrewery, a pub, a restaurant.
Okay.
And this building has been featured on several of the popular paranormal TV shows.
Right.
And you are well aware of my opinion of what a lot of those shows are. So I don't hold their evidence that they've acquired on these shows to any high regard. But so what I think where the hauntings in the Moon River brewery comes from,
right,
is that in 1876 there was an outbreak of yellow fever that went through Savannah.
Right.
And that building was used as a hospital during that epidemic. So again, I think you've got all of this residual energy that's just coming forth from this yellow fever epidemic that went through there.
Interesting. Yeah, and I'm just looking at some information here too, right? So the City Hotel was and is it's considered one of the most beautiful buildings in Savannah. It's been a landmark since it was first built. And so let's just see. So it said the City Hotel closed in 1864. So in terms of the actual hotel, it was really only in business it went into business in 1822. So about 40 years. Yes, and then it became, it does say that there was little before General Sherman took Savannah during the Civil War. The City Hotel never reopened after the war, and the building has been open, essentially just historic since that point. It's never been a hotel again, but it has seen quite a few owners. There are many people who can tell you that the ghosts left behind died tragic or violent deaths. If it's true, the Moon River Brewing Company is a haunted place. Enough violence has taken place inside the building to leave several spirits behind. And of course, there's literally all the hundreds of children that died there. So there was also apparently a shooting of a town vagrant in 1832. A doctor by the name of Dr. Philip Minus shot a drunk man named James Stark inside the hotel. He was a known drunk and troublemaker who seemed to have a reputation for insulting people. Minus shot Stark, insisted he had seen Stark going for his gun first. He was quickly acquitted as Stark was not liked in the town. So yeah, there just seems to be a lynch mob that marched through the city and into the hotel and dragged a gentleman by the name of Sinclair out. He was the anger and hate. So he was a Yankee. So they literally beat him near to death there inside the hotel. So yeah, it seems to have all kinds of fun activity in there. Anyways, let's take a little trip to New Orleans. So when we first started going to New Orleans, it was right after Katrina, and Ed had been there before. He'd gone there and in the late 70s and other times. I had never been. There's some areas in the Old View Carré that are really interesting. And, you know, one story comes to mind. We were there, I don't even know how many years ago it was now. Gosh, it seems not that long ago, but I'm going to say it was probably 6 years ago, maybe. Could have been longer. And a couple of our friends had come into town, and we went over to visit another friend. And she happened to live in a part of the Vieux Carré that is not touristy. It's north of Bourbon Street. It's sort of between Bourbon and Rampart, and a little bit closer to St. Philip. So it was an area where it's more residential, even though you're right in the quarter. And so she lived in a typical shotgun style house where you come in the front door and you enter into a living room of sorts. And then there's either an open concept or a hallway that'll run down one side of the house in literally a straight line. And I mean, the shotgun was essentially, you could open the front door and, sort of fire a gun, and it would go straight through and out the back. Because in New Orleans, people didn't have, like Savannah, it gets hot as Hades there.
Oh, yeah.
So, that concept was the easiest way to keep an airflow going through the house, right? The houses are raised off the ground to allow for airflow underneath. And also, you were able to open up windows down one side of the house, and this hallway or, open concept rooms going back with a back door would allow for air circulation. So her house was very much like that. We came in, there was a front room. I believe her second room in was the kitchen, and then the bedroom and that going back. Now, a lot of them, you come in, there's a sitting room, but then you have bedrooms, and then the kitchen's at the back of the house, which makes sense because when it's hot, you could open up and literally cook outside if you needed to, right? So in those times, you would have been cooking in a fireplace, essentially a cooking hearth, or outside. So it makes sense for it to be at the back of the house, away from everything else, right? It's not heating up the house. So we came in, we sat down. A really, really good friend of ours was there, and he's since passed on. And he was just such an amazing person, just in general. I've never met anybody like this guy. He was just the most caring, forgiving, wonderfully energy sort of emitting human being that I've ever met. And he was an amazing tarot card reader. And so we were there, and our friend was with us. And when we arrived at the house, I'd never been to the house before. And so we arrived at the house, and we went inside, and we sat down. And the room was kind of filled with people who emit certain energies, right? We all have our own very strong energy. Most of us were mediums or psychics of some sort in the room. And our friend who was with us, she's pretty sensitive, but she, there was, I think she said after the fact, there was times when she felt like she just wanted to get up and run out of the house. It was just too much for her. But what I found that was really weird and strange was, as I was sitting there, I kept envisioning something that didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I was like, I keep on seeing people, lots of people, but it wasn't people walking around, it was people lying down. And I was like, okay. So after this, we visited for a few hours, and we kind of left, and we were walking back. Our other friend, who the Seika gentleman, was talking, and he said, oh yeah. And I said, can I ask you a question? Why am I seeing this? And he sort of laughed, and he goes, oh, because her house is built on a cemetery. So at that time, when New Orleans was first being built, originally it was within the walls of the old quarter, right? The area now where there's a seawall, and then there was the nuns live a convent. There was the convent, and then it was surrounded by walls for protection, right? This small area, it wasn't very big at all. And so outside of that was where they would bury people. They didn't bury them within the wall area of the city. So on the outside. So at that time, in the late 1700s, there was like rampant yellow fever. There was a number of other things that were happening. So there was a lot of burials outside the walls of the old part of what is now known as the French Quarter. And so I kind of knew, but I didn't really put two and two together, just that it had really extended that far outside. But yeah, apparently there was these houses were built in the 1800s on top of cemeteries, old cemeteries that they didn't really have any markers or anything. I guess they were more like mass burials from yellow fever and that. And so they would dig them outside of the living, the area where people lived, and bury them there. So that kind of really, once I heard that, I was like, oh, well, that energy just makes complete sense then of what I was picking up in the house. But the other interesting thing is that some years ago, not too long ago, 4 years ago, they were building a boutique hotel right in the same area where we happened to be at that time. And they were digging in the back to put in a swimming pool. And what did they dig up? Bodies, right? So it was an extension of, quite a few blocks, like maybe 4 blocks that this old cemetery had been, had taken up. And literally none of these places, these older homes, have basements in New Orleans. There's no basements. So you're just building right on, ground level, raised on block, and away you go. So you've got all these homes that were built, so they would never know if it was not marked on a map, or maybe it was, and people just, built anyways, right? They were expanding outwards, and that cemetery was no longer being used, and probably hadn't been used in maybe 40 years. So they figure, what the heck, right? We'll just build on top of it. What people don't know, it doesn't, it doesn't hurt them. But definitely that area, every time I walk through there, it's just, for me, it's just so active. Like there is just so much energy and so much, it's like sometimes I'll be walking down the road, and it could be whenever in the evening, and be walking. And we used to stay in an apartment on St. Anne near Rampart Street. So we used to walk all the time. Like we never drove around there. It's like, who drives? So we would walk, and sometimes I'd just be walking at night, and I'd turn a corner on the street, and I just see people that, from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, just doing regular people things. It wasn't, like they weren't running up to me and going, oh, or anything ridiculous. It's just sort of like this weird walking into another dimension of time, and there would be things happening, and then, off you'd go. And a lot of times the houses that we were walking by were there, but sometimes they weren't, depending on where we were walking. So this is kind of a really weird thing, right? For me, I'm kind of used to being able to, walk through those kinds of situations and not get really freaked out. I just kind of listen. I just open everything up, and I just walk, right? And I just listen to what I can hear, the conversations that I hear, and I just keep going, and I just go, well, that was really cool, right? I just was privy to something that happened 100 years ago, and just keep going.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.